Welcome to Morningstar Christian Chapel YouTube channel. Please remember to hit that subscribe button, like button, and the notification bell so you can find out when we go live or post a new video. And be sure to leave a comment about what God has shown you in this message. Thanks, and enjoy the study.
Let's open our Bibles this morning to Luke chapter 11. Dennis will be out a little bit when we finish as well. Luke 11:37 for our study this morning. As we continue our study through the book of Luke, we are with Jesus currently in the last year of his ministry, probably 7 or 8 months away from the cross. Luke uses the term on the road with Jesus quite a bit during these chapters we're looking at. They follow the Lord speaking to his disciples more and more often about his way of salvation. It had started there in Caesarea Philippi, where in that last year he began to talk about how he would save and what it would cost. They, of course, had no concept of he dying in their place, and so it took a while. He also continued to prepare them for what they would be handed when he was finished with his work. And the crowds were huge. The opposition was now planning his death already, if they could get away with it. In fact, if you look at verse 29 of chapter 11, or verse 1 of chapter 12, you will see a couple of different comments about the crowds being thick and kind of rowdy, if you will. It seemed like a pretty interesting place to start teaching your disciples in the midst of this kind of chaos, but especially when we get to chapter 12, which kind of looks like it had been completely presented to them in the midst of this pushing and shoving crowd. The Lord had lots to say to us about serving him in this kind of world that is so opposed to him. We've spent 5 weeks so far in chapter 11. We started with the disciples asking if Jesus could teach them to pray like the disciples did, like John's disciples were taught. The Lord gave them that outline for prayer that we sometimes call the Lord's Prayer. It is hardly that. And then he spoke from verse 6 to verse 13 about our attitudes in prayer, persistence. How does that figure in? And how does that work if we are to continue to ask and to seek and to knock? In verse 14, he delivers a man from demon possession that was left him both blind and mute, according to Matthew. The opposition religious leader said, well, he's got power because he's in league with the devil. And Jesus answered their challenges with very merciful kind of logic. Hey, look, if I'm working with the devil, how's that benefiting his kingdom? Gave them a logical answer, was very merciful, gave them a warning about what road they were headed on, and then mercifully asked them to change their minds, follow him. Another group of people there said, well, maybe he's not in league with the devil. We could use another sign. And Jesus said, evil generation seeks a sign. What more do you want than a guy who's mute and blind and possessed now delivered? No sign shall be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And Jesus looked at the resurrection and presented that as the sign to end all signs. So this morning we come to verse 37, and Jesus is invited by a Pharisee to dinner. And the Lord takes this opportunity to talk to these religious men about having clean hands and dirty hearts. So we're going to start with this morning down through verse 44. We're going to finish it, Lord be willing, next Sunday morning. But verse 37 says this, and as he spoke, a certain Pharisee asked him to dine with him, and so he went in and he sat down to eat. If you don't have any historical background or insight or hindsight, you might come to the conclusion that the Pharisees would have been folks that at some point would have said, we're going to follow him. He's fulfilled all that we know. After all, at least historically, not many Pharisees were from the upper class. They weren't wealthy people for the most part. They were common folks. In the society, they were looked to, well, sometimes it's brutal, but other times it's just holy men who are devoted to the ritual of the law. In fact, many scribes, seem to follow the law just almost in a traditional sense. The Mishnah, there is a portion there that says that tradition hems in or hedges in the law. So at least from an outward standpoint, these guys were doing their best in many ways. Unfortunately, when you start to look to yourself for hope like this, it wasn't long before these Pharisees developed into people who saw their righteousness by their works. They worked very hard at being righteous. They would pull their clothes around them and not talk to you in the street and do their religious deeds in a way that you could admire. And it wasn't long before they began to despise other people who weren't like that. We were much more committed, especially in the area of like giving, where they were, took great pride in even counting out their spice seeds and, 9 for me, 1 for you. It was just nonsense at best. So when Jesus came, instead of rejoicing in the one that had been promised, that would fulfill the law of God for them, if you will, and offer forgiveness to them, they didn't see need for him at all. And so they rejected Jesus quickly, and soon they became one of his greatest enemies. These religious men who outwardly seemed to have a lot going for them, but inwardly they were destitute of all that God had to provide. Jesus had just finished dealing with, like I said, those two sets of unbelievers, the one who had accused him of being in league with the devil, and the other who refused the evidence of his power. So, as he was speaking, one of these Pharisees said, "Well, want to have dinner at my house?" And he invited him in to supper. As he spoke, we read there in verse 37. By the way, Jesus never refused a dinner invitation. Not one time, as far as I can tell. Luke is the one, maybe more than anyone else, that provides us some of the table talk of Jesus sitting at dinner with different folks as he ministered to them one way or the other. I think there's something to be said for eating with folks. Certainly from a Jewish standpoint, there are people in Israel, if you're there on the Sabbath, that might invite you to their house for dinner. You might never have met them, but there's something to be said for having dinner, right? And participating in the same meal, finding strength from the same food. My wife and I this year have committed to, since we're just the two of us at home, and we eat out probably far more than we should. It's almost easier to start really praying for the folks that we go to certain restaurants all the time, we tend to have the same servers, and so we're praying that we can get to some of these folks with the gospel. And really, it has been pretty interesting to watch God begin to move in some of these hearts. So I like this idea of ministry over food, and I think the Lord did as well. We are told in verse 38 that when the Pharisees saw, verse 37, and as he spoke, a certain Pharisee asked him to come in and eat, and so he went in and he sat down to eat, and when the Pharisee saw it, he marveled that he hadn't first washed before dinner. You have to know Jesus was aware of what was going on here, that this kind of invitation had attached to it some hidden kind of malevolence. There was an agenda here. This guy was part of that group, those religious folks who didn't want anything to do with Jesus. And so I think him skipping the ceremonial kind of washing that was required by their law, I should say, was a calculated move to focus on the real issues, because he was going to dinner with an eye towards reaching this guy with his love and with the gospel, with the good news of his coming. Traditionally, at least in that culture, you would have eaten without utensils, so washing your hands would have been a good idea. But again, the Pharisee was concerned not so much with cleanliness as the ceremonial law that he was dictated by. In fact, the Mishnah has paragraphs on how to wash your hands properly and how not to wash them properly. So I think Jesus skipped it intentionally. I think that he, was targeting this ritual, and it wasn't God's word anyway. It was their word, if you will, and so he was going to rattle the religious cage a little bit, so he might have an opportunity to speak to them about who he was. So this host noticed what Jesus, he just came in, sat down, and started eating. Thanks for the invite. And it was, it caused him some consternation. And so the Lord, I think, used that as an opportunity to begin to minister to him. Notice verse 38, it says that the Pharisee was left marveling, like, I can't believe this. The word marveling here, Greek word, it literally means to be out of one's senses. Like, what is he doing? Jesus said to him, who was marveling, and I don't know if he voiced his opinion or just his face did, "Now you Pharisees make the outside of the cup and the dish clean, but your inward part is full of greed and wickedness. Foolish ones, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? Rather give alms of such things as you have, then indeed all things are clean to you." As their hands were still damp from their ceremonial washings, which, by the way, you couldn't dry, you had to air dry. Because if you dried them, then you made them, defiled again. So even if you go to the, in Israel, if you go to the Wailing Wall, you'll see the folks they'll wash, but then you got to do one of these things, So while they're doing one of these things, air dried, Jesus began to speak to them about their love for their external religion, while insides their hearts were anything but clean. He uses the words greedy and wicked, selfish. Verse 39, we're told that the Lord said to them that their interest was the outside of the cup. How many people do you think today have their greatest interest in being perceived as being a religious person on the outside? So they clean up their lives much like, setting the stage for a play. They're big on pomp. They make a big deal out of their giving, or they emphasize their meet and greets, and they're very quick to make friends, a good show. They always want to work the crowds. And that was pretty much the life of this Pharisee and these Pharisees in Jesus' eyes. Self-righteous, self-satisfied. Jesus revealing he knew their hearts were still filled with the sin of loving gain and corrupt dealings and all about the glory that came from their position. He said in verse 40, what a foolish position to take when you fail to realize or take into account that God made both the inside and the outside. In other words, you live your life just cleaning up the outside, not really being concerned with others, what others don't see, and forget that God sees it all. He made it all. God is not fooled by your outward appearance. We can be fooled, but he can't. When Samuel was sent to find a replacement for Saul, and he saw Eliab, the oldest son, and he went, well, that guy looks like a king. And it is the Lord who said to Samuel, man looks at the outward, God looks at the heart. Don't you know God made you inside and out and sees both your clean hands and your dirty heart? And your hands kind of contradict what I see when I look a little bit deeper. I think we should always be more concerned with gaining God's approval than the people sitting next to you in the pew. What you really want to hear is the Lord saying, well done. Not your neighbor saying, hey, you are amazing. Because it's easy to get amazing from people. It's a little bit more difficult to impress the Lord. He's impressed by humility and faith and repentance, sorrow. So, the tendency, unfortunately, for many people is to focus on the outside where men's judgments are at and try to get their approval. And I think that sometimes, we know that God's opinion about us varies greatly from what others think. But when the Lord wrote to the Laodicean church there in chapter 3 of Revelation, he said to them, I hear what you're saying, that you're rich and wealthy and you have need of nothing. And he said, and you have no idea that you're poor and wretched and miserable and blind and naked. Here's my counsel. Come buy from me gold that's been refined in the fire so you can be rich. And I'll give you some white clothing that you can hide your nakedness. I'll give you some eye salve that you can see. In other words, the Lord sees far more than you do or are willing to admit. The psalmist wrote in Psalm 139, Lord, search me and know my heart. Try me, know my thoughts. See if there's any wicked ways in me and lead me in the ways of everlasting life. So often what we aren't even willing to admit about ourselves, God sees very clearly. David, as he was haunted by his sin with Bathsheba for that year or so when he kind of exiled himself and it gave Absalom a chance to go out and work the crowds and try to overthrow his father, wrote in Psalm 51 as he was struggling, Lord, I know you desire truth in the inward parts. In the hidden part, you should make me to know wisdom. So create in me a clean heart. Renew a right spirit within me. That was the problem with these religious folks. Oh, they looked good on the outside. Their hands were clean. Their hearts were not. And God's not interested so much in your hands. In fact, Jesus walked right past the hand cleaning part because that wasn't the issue. The issue was the heart. I can almost see some of the Pharisees quickly hiding those dripping wet hands. You fools can't fool God, and to try to do so is foolish. Your hands are clean, all right, but what about your heart? So Jesus literally in verse 41 says, give yourself to God, make your alms, your offerings, bring to the Lord your life. And then everything you do and everything you will give will be acceptable in his sight. Let him clean your heart. You'll be clean inside and out. Your actions and your motive will be in alignment. It will be one and the same thing. It'll arise from the same source. And his invitation was very clear. He's been speaking, if you go back to chapter 11, for a long time to this crowd about the relationship that you can have with God. God is interested in your heart. He wants to change your heart. To clean up your dirty vocabulary, it'll take more than brushing your teeth. You're going to have to get a new heart. It's the same for lust. It's the same for anger. It's the same for hatred and jealousy. You need a new heart. We need God to come and give us a new heart. We need to be born of his Spirit. The outward display of any of those things can be curbed. The Pharisees were able to restrain a lot of that sinfulness to just within. You couldn't really see it watching. But if you could know their hearts, you could see it, and God knew their hearts. Only God can remove you from those things that can dominate you. Even though you can suppress them and hide them, you can't rid yourself of them. Religion can reform behavior, but Jesus can give you a new heart that will bring with it a new will and new intentions and make us clean. Covering a wicked heart with outward religious washing isn't new. In the midst of a tremendously downturn in spiritual life of Israel as a nation in chapter 1 of Isaiah, the prophet said, come and I can make you clean. Your sins are like crimson. I can make them as white as wool, but you got to come. And he lists, I should say, from verse 10 through verse 20 or so, the list of their religious activities that they were doing diligently and faithfully. And the Lord just shook his head and said, I don't want any of these. I'm really not moved by any of them. In chapter 5 of Amos, the Lord said to them, I hate, and then he stopped and he said, I despise your feast days. I don't savor your sacred assemblies. You offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings. I don't accept them. I won't regard them. Take them away from me. Your songs are nothing more than noise to me. I don't hear the melody of your stringed instruments. You need to let judgment come down like water and righteousness to come from your life like a mighty stream. All the outward religion God was sick of because he wants the heart. He wants your heart. He wants my heart. Micah would write, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow before the Most High God? Shall I come with burnt offerings and a calf that is a year old? Will the Lord be pleased if I bring him 1,000 rams or 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, or the fruit of my womb, of my body for the sin of my soul? And then he writes this, no. He's shown you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you. He wants you to do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Only can happen if God comes in and changes the heart. Jesus said, I love the Lord's boldness going into a Pharisee's house and going, yeah, you guys are great at washing your hands. But here's what you should do. Give me your life. Give God your life. Make your alms, your sacrifice, your giving to him. And one of the I think primary topics of the prophets in writing to God's people was to warn them of the duplicity between religiously outward clean hands and dirty hearts. Only God changes the heart. David wrote in Psalm 51, he was aware of what God wanted. He just couldn't get himself there without God's help. So what follows are 3 woes from Jesus to these Pharisees and his friends in their religious position. And when he is interrupted by a complaint from one of the lawyers present in verse 45, he gives him 3 woes as well. We're only going to take the first 3 woes today so we don't go home too hurt. As he directs them, these lawyers, to say, your handling of God's word has caused people to turn away from God rather than to turn to him. Verse 42. So Jesus said to this Pharisee, woe to you, Pharisees, plural, for you do tithe from mint and rue and all manner of herbs, but you'll pass by justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. So Jesus begins to apply what he has just said to their much ballyhooed pride of giving that the Pharisees had made a display of in exacting their tithes. By the way, the words woe to you are never good. They're never used in a positive tense. It always is that warning kind of sound where you're in danger of not making the distinction between an action and an attitude, between a behavior and an intent of the heart that produces the action. It is always the same. Through every scripture that you find, woe is you, there's always that call to not miss the distinction. On the one hand, the Pharisees tithed, which is more than I can say for a lot of people in church. And the Lord said that was something good that they did. In fact, they went beyond the interpretation of the law, their own Mishnah, the one that the written law that they had so extrapolated over. Started with 10 Commandments, they ended up with many, and thousands of pages to explain them. But even their own Mishnah said when it came to certain spices like rue, they were exempt from tithing laws. But the Pharisees, we're going to do even that. We're amazing. I think most pastors would love a few Pharisees in their church who are regular givers. But Jesus here not only places value on their giving, he said that was a right action, but what he said, he goes back to that clean hands, dirty heart. It's good that your hands did the things that you did in terms of giving, but you did it with a wrong heart. You let justice go. You passed by the love of God. In the context, you didn't help anybody. You didn't serve anybody. You're just trying to make a name for yourself and establish yourself, make sure everyone sees what you're doing. The Pharisees had calculated diving down to the seed, to the decimal point. But whenever somebody else needed their help, they became, as stingy as a Dickens novel. Giving without a heart for God will not give you that place with God that you hoped for. Because again, God's interested in the heart. And until you give from a pure heart, probably shouldn't give at all. Can't buy God's interest. He doesn't need your financial help. He's God after all. He doesn't rely upon you to give. He's not impressed with your giving. So I give it all because it helps me to realize that I am dependent upon him for my very existence, that he provides all that I have, and it allows me to invest in eternal things, which are the most important to me, hopefully. But God, giving isn't God's way of raising funds. You should have seen the mail we got here when we were doing the building, and people drive by and they have these building campaigns, and we can raise capital and bring us in. We got a team. We can get people to empty out their wallets. I'm thinking, you guys are idiots. Unless the Lord build the house, you're laboring in vain. I believe tithing is biblical. I think it's necessary, but I know it only pleases the Lord when it comes from a right heart, and that's true for almost every church activity, whether it is giving or it's communion or baptism or ministry service or baby dedications. I don't care what it is. It is only pleasing in the Lord's eyes when it is driven by obedience from a pure heart, because God's interested in the heart. It's kind of like trying to convince someone in leadership in the church that they need to go to church regularly. As far as I'm concerned, if that's not in their hearts, they shouldn't be serving at all. Because that's just a given. You got to have that in your heart. If you don't have that there, you're not in any position to lead anyone. If your heart isn't burning and hungry, then no matter how you serve outwardly, it's not going to do. Maybe the worst thing, and you see it in the Pharisees here, when you begin to rely on outward rituals, you develop very quickly a false sense of well-being. Well, I went forward. Okay, are you walking with the Lord? No, I went forward. Are you going to go to heaven? Yep, I was baptized. Is that really enough? Jesus said, woe to you, for that is a false confidence. God wants the inside clean. Blessed are the pure in heart. He wants a motive of love for him that will drive you to your outward actions for him. That's why James was able to write in chapter 1 of his little epistle at the back of your Bible, pure and undefiled religion before God is this, that you visit the orphans and the widows in their trouble. Keep yourself unspotted from the world. We need a new heart. And notice verse 43, he said, woe to you, never good, Pharisees, for you love the best seats in the synagogue and the greetings in the marketplace. I suspect these wet hands are now sweaty palms. Kind of in the hot seat with Jesus here. Not only was their heart wrong in regards to their giving, their desires in serving were motivated by pride. In other words, the heart was still all wrong. And Jesus again reveals their hearts, that they were self-driven in their behavior and their lust. He called it wickedness in verse 39 and greedy. What was wrong with these guys? They used their position to lead others spiritually into getting the best seats at the best dinners so that they could be seen, to be acknowledged, and greeted with words of respect and honor publicly in the marketplace where everyone could stand in awe. They could wander in and wander out. Oh, did you see who that was? Yeah, that's amazing. They received adulation and the praises of men, but they weren't seeking the approval or the honor or the praise of the Lord. Oh, you're a board member? Oh, yes. You're a worship leader? You're the pastor? I certainly am. I once saw an ad for a concert that headliner said, all-star worship band. This is an oxymoron. If we're coming to worship Jesus, what do we need an all-star worship band for? Just bring the worship band. Woe to you! An expression of anger or of regret or of sadness. I think it must break the heart of God to see his children ever, in service only to look for the applause or the glory or the honor that it brings, as opposed to dying to themselves. But that was the problem with these religious guys. They look good on the outside. God is always interested in the heart. And that should be a great encouragement and a tremendous fearful thought for some. The last woe, verse 44, woe to you, scribes and you Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you are like graves which are not seen, and the men who walk over them are not aware of them. After this lawyer will speak up and say, hey, you're not talking about us, are you? We'll get to him next week. But this last law had to do with the ceremonial law, if you will, which stated that if you walked on a grave, you were left unclean ceremoniously for a week. You couldn't do your job, you couldn't enter the temple, you couldn't be around others in terms of ministry. A traveling pilgrim would need good markers in those days to stay away from the graves. They were oftentimes whitewashed to be able to spot them a little better, to mark the place of the dead. So Jesus said this third woe to the same Pharisees, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites. Hypocrito, it means, a man who wears a mask, someone who pretends to be something they're not showing their true self, if you will. Except God already knows it. You're much like unmarked graves. People get near you, and they don't realize it, but by the time they leave you, you've defiled them. You've led them astray. They follow your teachings, you've polluted them. You won't go into the kingdom, but you'll restrain others from going in on their own. You leave them far away from the Lord. You're like an unsuspected, contaminating agent that leaves folks unable to come to the Lord or not draw near to him. You're not a help, you're a huge hindrance. You bunch of hypocrites. Oh, it must have been nice to go to dinner with Jesus. Well, only if you're this way. They were monstrously deceptive. They affected others with their band of religion. They didn't practice it. They were driven by greed and wickedness and selfishness and pride and deceptiveness. And they were affecting others. That's what the Lord said, because your life will affect others. We should be aware of that. How did the people see the Pharisees? Well, when Jesus said to the disciples in the Sermon on the Mount, unless your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never get to heaven. And the disciples said this, well, if that's the case, who's going to make it? Because the opinion of these guys were, if anyone's going to make it, they are. And Jesus said, you guys are nothing but a destructive influence. You're not helping, you're destroying. The Pharisees were externally as religious as you can get, but their real heart was far removed from their external behavior. They looked good. Let me say this to you. You look good this morning in church. Beyond that, I can't tell. But I know God can. It's important that you go home knowing that God sees it all and he's fine with it. Eventually, the deception comes out. The way you rectify any situation, if there's a conflict with those, you go to the Lord and you humble yourself and you ask him to make you new. You ask him to save you. His blood will cleanse you from the inside so that your outside can be like the inside. But you have to bring your alms, your sacrifice. You have to give yourself to him first. Once the heart is right, all that other stuff works out just fine. So like I said, you look good. Quiet, attentive, most of you. Happy to be here. May the Lord be pleased with what he finds when he looks inside. Father, thank you this morning for your word to us and how good it is to be able to gather together as your people and to spend some time in your word, considering your every word. And Lord, that you might speak to us even this morning about that our hearts and our hands might be the same. They might be clean. They might be pleasing in your sight. It'll be that which honors you and brings glory to your name. And if you are here this morning and you are not comfortable thinking about the Lord seeing you from the inside out, the good news is the Lord is available to cleanse you from the inside. He'll send his Spirit into your heart. He'll wash you clean by the blood that his Son shed for you. He'll leave you with a slate that is clean. He can save you even this morning. And if that's you this morning, then it just takes a simple prayer. Lord, you see what I see and what I know. Cleanse me, make me whole, make me new. And God will do that. John chapter 6, it said he'll not in any way turn away those who come to him. Doesn't matter where you've been or what you've done. He'll take you just the way you are. He's just not going to leave you that way. So you can pray that prayer right where you're sitting. And afterwards, when we dismiss, you can come up and talk to one of the pastors and tell them you prayed to receive the Lord this morning. And we will get you started with some Bible studies to assure you that God means what he says. If you're watching online this morning, same goes for you. God is able to save and to deliver and to make new. All you have to do is ask. There's a link in the description box down at the bottom where you're watching that will take you to a page on the internet that says, how can I be born again? And you can read there what the Lord has promised to do. And then if you'd like, call the office in the morning. We'd be happy to pray with you, talk to you, answer your questions. But look, God's interested in your heart. We can fool the world, but not our God. We can leave an impression with man, but God is most impressed with a heart that is humbled and repentant and in faith turned to him. Don't put that off another day. If the Lord brought you here today to convict and to bring you in, let God do that work. Let him do that work in you today. Shall we stand together?